The ships arrived on a Tuesday morning, when most of Earth was just waking up to another ordinary day. Commander Sarah Chun stood on the observation deck of the International Space Station and watched as the massive vessels materialized from nowhere. Like ghosts becoming solid in the black void of space, each ship was the size of a small city, and they numbered in the hundreds, surrounding Earth in a perfect sphere that blocked out portions of the stars. Within an hour, every screen on Earth broadcast the same message in every language humanity had ever spoken. The Galactic Concordat had arrived, and they came bearing gifts of knowledge and an invitation to join the civilized species of the galaxy. Sarah felt her stomach turn as she watched the elegant alien ambassador speak with a voice like wind chimes about friendship and unity and the glorious future awaiting humanity among the stars. Dr. Marcus Webb sat in his laboratory at CERN and listened to the broadcast with his team gathered around him in silence. Something about the ambassador's words felt wrong, like a sales pitch that was too polished, too rehearsed. When the alien mentioned that humanity would join as a junior species with a standard integration period, Marcus felt ice water flood his veins. He pulled up the data packet the Concordat had transmitted and began reading through the treaty documents that Earth's governments were already preparing to sign. His hand started shaking on page 47th. Integration period wasn't a mentorship program or a cultural exchange. It was 500 years of indentured servitude, where humanity would provide labor and resources and soldiers to the Concordat in exchange for technology and protection. Page 63 made it clear that refusal would be considered an act of hostility against the galactic community. Page 91 outlined the consequences of hostility with clinical precision. Admiral James Kozlov was already moving before the politicians finished their emergency sessions. He commanded the Europa Station, the newest and most remote of humanity's deep space installations, and he knew an invasion when he saw one. The Concordat had positioned their ships perfectly to control Earth's orbitals and cut off any escape routes. This wasn't first contact. This was a cage being closed. He sent encrypted messages to every military vessel in the outer solar system, ordering them to go dark and retreat beyond Neptune's orbit. Most ignored him, saying he was paranoid and insubordinate. 17 ships obeyed. Sarah watched from the ISS as Earth's governments met with the Concordat representatives in Geneva. Aliens were beautiful in an unsettling way, with too many joints and skin that shifted colors like oil on water. They smiled with too many teeth and spoke about the honor of serving the greater galactic good. The human diplomats asked about the length of service, and the aliens laughed like parents amused by a child's question. 500 years was nothing, they said. When species live for thousands, humans would barely notice the time passing. When the human diplomats pushed back, suggesting a shorter period or more favorable terms, the Concordat representatives stopped smiling. The Vulcan military commander stepped forward, then massive and armored with eyes like black holes, he spoke one sentence. Perhaps a demonstration would clarify your position. The fleet around Mars lit up with weapons fire that made nuclear bombs look like candles. Mars had been humanity's greatest achievement, a colony of 5,000 souls and dozens of terraforming stations, building toward a dream of a second home for humanity. The bombardment lasted 17 seconds. When it ended, Mars was gone, replaced by a spreading cloud of asteroids and dust and the flash-frozen bodies of 5,000 people who had been alive moments before. Sarah vomited in zero gravity and then wept as she watched humanity's future die in silence. The message was clear: refuse, and Earth would follow Mars into extinction. Marcus watched the destruction from Earth and felt something break inside him. He thought of his daughter living in Tokyo and his parents in their retirement home in Florida, and every person he had ever loved or known. The Concordat could end all of it with less effort than it took him to breathe. When the treaty was signed 2 days later with every nation on Earth Capitulating without firing a single shot in return, Marcus knew that humanity had just sold itself into slavery to survive. The collection began immediately. Concordat transport ships descended on every major city and town, taking 7 billion humans in batches of 10,000 families were separated based on skills and age and genetic profiles. Children over 10 were taken for education programs. Adults went to labor assignments scattered across 1,000 worlds. The elderly and sick were classified as non-essential. No one asked what happened to the non-essential ones. Sarah was designated as military stock due to her tactical training and command experience. She was loaded onto a transport with 10,000 other soldiers and officers, stripped of rank and uniform and humanity. The ship's hold was cramped and cold and smelled like fear. Valkarn Overseer walked among them with a weapon that could turn flesh to ash. He explained in broken English that they were property now, and property that disobeyed was destroyed. Sarah memorized his face and promised herself that she would live long enough to make him regret every word. Marcus was taken to a research facility on a world whose name he couldn't pronounce. The facility was staffed by a dozen different alien species, all working on weapons and biotech for the Concordat military. His new supervisor was a spider-like creature with 8 eyes that never blinked. It gave Marcus his first assignment, engineering a plague that would pacify rebellious populations without killing them. When Marcus hesitated, the supervisor showed him a live feed of Earth. Concordat administrators now controlled every government and city resist, and they would demonstrate on Earth what they had demonstrated on Mars. Marcus began working on the plague. Admiral Kozlov watched from his hidden base in the Oort cloud as Earth was stripped of its people and resources. His small fleet of 17 ships was all that remained of free humanity. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and outclassed by technology that seemed like magic, but they were free and they were angry. Kozlov gathered his captains in the command center of his flagship. "They think we're broken," he said quietly. "They think we'll accept chains and learn to love our cages." He looked at each face, tired and haunted, but still defiant. "We're going to prove them wrong," he continued. "It might take decades or centuries, but we're going to remember what they did, and we're going to make them regret the day they decided to enslave humanity." The captains nodded and began planning for a war that might not come in their lifetimes. On Earth, the Concordat administrators watched the last transports leave, carrying the final groups of humans to their assignments across the galaxy. One administrator, a sleek reptilian creature, turned to its companion, another primitive species, integrated. It said with satisfaction, "In a generation they won't even remember they were ever free." Its companion nodded in agreement, never imagining that those words would one day be carved on a monument built from the ruins of their homeworld. The day humanity was enslaved, the galaxy barely noticed it was just another Tuesday in the endless expansion of the Concordat. No one suspected that this Tuesday had just planted the seeds of the Concordat's destruction. 150 years had passed since the day the transports took humanity away from Earth. Sarah Chen was old now, far older than any human had a right to be after living through decades of combat in the Concordats. Endless border wars, the alien medical technology kept soldiers alive and functional long past their natural spans because trained warriors were too valuable to waste. She commanded the 47th Penal Battalion, a force of 5,000 human soldiers who fought the Concordat's battles on worlds too dangerous or too worthless for the military to care about losses. Her hair had gone white, and her face was mapped with scars, but her eyes still burned with the same fury she felt watching Mars die. The Valkarn overseers thought the fight had been beaten out of humanity generations ago. They were wrong. Sarah stood in the barracks on some forgettable moon orbiting some forgettable world and watched her soldiers clean weapons and repair armor. They looked like any other defeated people going through the motions of survival, but Sarah knew better. Hidden in maintenance tunnels and carved into the walls in code that looked like random scratches were messages. The messages came from Earth and from the mining colonies, and from the research stations, and from every place humans had been scattered across the galaxy. The remember was what they called themselves, the vast secret network of humans who refused to forget. They communicated through dead drops and coded phrases, and exploited every gap in the alien surveillance systems. Concordat thought humans were too primitive to understand their security, too broken to organize resistance. The Concordat was learning that underestimating humans was a fatal mistake, but they were learning too slowly. Tonight Sarah would add another cache of stolen weapons to the hidden armory beneath the barracks. Tomorrow, she would conduct training exercises that looked standard, but taught her soldiers how to kill their overseers with maximum efficiency. Next month, when the Velkarn rotated to new assignments, she would have complete control of this base. In 5 years, when the signal came, she would lead her battalion in the liberation of this entire sector. She checked her datapad and saw the latest message encoded in a supply requisition form. Earth remembers, Earth rises. Sue Marcus Webb had been moved 17 times in 150 years from facility to facility, wherever the Concordat needed weapons that could break stubborn populations. He was considered one of their most valuable assets because he had a gift for creating horrors that were efficient and elegant. The spider supervisor had died 80 years ago, and Marcus had felt nothing watching it dissolve in one of its own chemical baths. Accidents happened in research facilities. His current facility was on a world called Talthmer, home to one of the Concordat's founding species. Marcus worked in a tower that reached into the clouds, surrounded by the best and brightest minds the galaxy could offer. They thought he was their colleague, their fellow scientist working toward the advancement of galactic civilization. They had no idea he was documenting every biological weakness of every species in the Concordat. He had files on genetic vulnerabilities and immune system defects and reproductive cycles and atmospheric requirements. Knew which species could be blinded by specific light frequencies and which would suffocate in certain gas mixtures, and which had allergies that could trigger fatal reactions. The Concordat had forced him to become an expert in ending life. They never considered he would turn that expertise against them. Marcus maintained a second lab hidden behind false walls accessed through maintenance shafts that the aliens assumed were too small for humans to navigate. In that lab, he cultured modified viruses and synthesized compounds and tested delivery mechanisms. He wasn't building weapons to kill. Killing was too simple and too merciful. He was building weapons to cripple, to incapacitate, to remove the Concordat's military capability without genocide. When the signal came, he would release his creations and watch as the galaxy's slave masters found themselves helpless. He checked his terminal and saw the coded message buried in a research grant proposal. Earth remembers, Earth rises. Soon in the frozen darkness beyond Neptune's orbit, Admiral James Kozlov had been dead for 90 years. His great-granddaughter, Admiral Elena Kozlov, commanded what had grown from 17 ships to nearly 200 vessels. The Hidden Fleet had spent 15 decades scavenging from battlefields and raiding abandoned stations and reverse engineering every piece of alien technology they could steal. They had no planets and no stations that the Concordat knew about. They lived on ships and bred children who knew only the cold of space and the heat of rage. Elena walked through the engineering bay of her flagship, watching technicians install weapons systems that made Concordat cruisers look like toys. Humanity had learned from the best and then improved on it. The aliens had better technology, but they had grown complacent, safe in their superiority. They followed rules of engagement and honored conventions and limited their warfare to what was civilized. Humans had learned every rule so they would know which ones to break. The fleet had grown not just from salvage, but from defectors. Other slave species had seen what humans were building and offered their services. Some wanted freedom, and some wanted revenge. And some just wanted to see the Concordat burn. Elena welcomed them all. She stood before the holographic display showing the galaxy mapped with every human population, every Concordat military base, every strategic resource the Remember had been feeding her intelligence for years. She knew where to strike and when and how to maximize damage, while minimizing human casualties. The attack plan was simple in concept and nightmarishly complex in execution. 147 worlds would rise. Simultaneously, every human in the galaxy would become a soldier at the exact same moment. The Concordat would face total war on every front at once. Their response time would be measured in weeks. Humanity's response time would be measured in seconds. Elena checked her chronometer and saw the countdown: 3 months until liberation. 3 months until humanity reminded the galaxy why apex predators should never be caged. She thought of her great-grandfather, who had died without seeing his dream of freedom realized. "We kept the fire burning," she whispered to his memory. "Now we're going to burn down everything they built." Across the galaxy, in 1,000 different locations, humans went about their daily routines of servitude. They mined ore in toxic atmospheres and fought in wars they didn't care about and conducted research that would be used against other innocents. The Concordat saw compliance and submission. They saw broken people who had accepted their place in the galactic order. They never looked closely enough to see the rage simmering beneath the surface. They never noticed the patterns in the scratches on walls or the meaning hidden in casual conversations. They never wondered why humans always volunteered for the most dangerous assignments that took them near weapons depots and communication hubs. The Concordat had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 years, and in all that time, they had never faced a coordinated rebellion. They assumed their slaves were too scattered and too monitored and too broken to organize. They had forgotten the first rule of enslaving intelligent beings. You can chain the body, but if the mind stays free, you have created an enemy that will wait and watch and plan until the moment comes to strike. That moment was approaching like a storm on the horizon. Sarah Chun trained her soldiers and hid weapons and waited. Marcus Webb cultured his viruses and refined his compounds and waited. Elena Kozlov positioned her fleet and synchronized her chronometers and waited. Millions of humans across hundreds of worlds maintained their masks of submission and waited. The signal would come soon. The remember would become the reckoning, and the galaxy would learn what happens when humanity decides that enough is enough. In the administrative centers on Earth where Concordat bureaucrats managed the flow of resources from humanity's homeworld, one young administrator filed a report. The report noted a slight increase in equipment failures and communication glitches across human populations. The administrator flagged it as potentially concerning. The supervisor reviewed it, marked it as low priority, and filed it away. After all, what could slaves possibly do that the mighty Concordat couldn't handle that? Failure to imagine that failure to take the threat seriously would cost the Concordat everything, but they wouldn't realize that until it was far too late. The clock ticked down toward Liberation Day, and humanity sharpened its knives in the dark liberation. They began at exactly 040 Galactic Standard time across 847 worlds simultaneously. Sarah Chun gave the signal with 3 words transmitted across every hidden channel. The Remember had built Earth rises now. What happened next would be studied by military historians for centuries as the most perfect coordinated assault in galactic history. In the barracks on the nameless moon, Sarah's soldiers moved with practiced precision. They rehearsed this moment 10,000 times in secret. The Velkarn overseer never saw the blade that opened his throat. His second-in-command died when Sarah put a stolen plasma rifle against his skull and pulled the trigger. Within 5 minutes, every alien on the base was dead, and every human was armed. Within 10 minutes, they had control of the base's defense systems and communication. Arrays within 20 minutes, they were broadcasting jamming signals that blinded. Concordat sensors across the entire sector. Sarah stood in the command center watching tactical displays light up with green markers as human forces across hundreds of worlds reported successful uprisings. It was beautiful. On Talthmar, Marcus Webb walked into the research facility's environmental control room with a sealed case. The guards knew him as the brilliant but harmless human scientist who barely spoke to anyone. They never suspected the case contained 150 years of carefully engineered revenge. Marcus connected his storage device to the atmospheric system and uploaded his life's work. The modified viruses were masterpieces of genetic targeting. Each one was tailored to attack specific Concordat species based on unique markers in their biology. They wouldn't kill, not immediately, but they would incapacitate, shutting down immune systems and triggering cascading organ failures that would leave victims helpless for weeks. Marcus had designed 12 variants for the 12 most militarily significant species in the Concordat. Within hours, they would spread through every major population center. The Concordat's ability to respond to the uprising would collapse as their soldiers and pilots and commanders fell ill. Marcus watched the progress bars complete and felt nothing he had become death, but only because they had taught him how. The facility alarms started blaring as other humans in the complex began their own uprisings. Marcus didn't run. He sat in the control room and waited for whatever came next, knowing that his part was done. Beyond Neptune, Elena Kozlov's fleet dropped out of stealth mode and accelerated toward the inner system at speeds that should have torn the ships apart. Human engineering had improved the alien drives beyond their original specifications. Her fleet numbered 237 vessels, crewed by 15,000 souls who had never known anything but preparation for this moment. They hit the Concordat defense perimeter around Earth like a hammer through glass. The alien ships tried to respond, but their targeting systems couldn't track vessels moving that fast. Human missiles modified with warheads that bypassed energy shields tore through cruiser armor. Human fighters piloted by third-generation warriors who had trained since childhood danced through defensive fire that should have vaporized them. The battle for Earth lasted 6 hours. When it ended, 300 Concordat vessels were debris, and Elena's fleet had lost 42 ships. The cost was acceptable. Elena broadcast on all frequencies to every human on Earth and every Concordat administrator. This is Admiral Elena Kozlov of the Free Human Fleet, she said. Earth is liberated. Any alien remaining on the surface has 1 hour to evacuate before we begin orbital bombardment of all Concordat installations. She paused. Any alien who has harmed a human will not be given that hour. The evacuation became a stampede. Sarah's forces spread across their sector like wildfire. The Concordat had made a critical mistake by using humans as shock troops and garrisoning them near strategic installations. Now those same humans turned their training and their knowledge of Concordat tactics against their former masters. They knew which defenses were strongest and which were vulnerable. They knew which commanders would fight and which would run. They knew how to inflict maximum psychological damage because the Concordat had taught them within 72 hours. Sarah's battalion had liberated 18 worlds and captured enough weapons and ships to arm another 10,000 soldiers. Freed humans flocked to her banner, eager to join the fight. The Concordat's local command tried to organize a counterattack. Sarah destroyed their fleet before it finished, assembling using tactics that violated every galactic convention on warfare. She didn't care about conventions. Conventions were for civilized species, and humanity had been stripped of civilization when Mars died. Marcus's bioweapons spread faster than the Concordat could track. The viruses moved through trade routes and transport ships and ventilation systems. Within a week, 12 species found their military forces collapsing. Soldiers couldn't pilot ships. Commanders couldn't give orders, and medical facilities were overwhelmed trying to treat victims. The Concordat declared a medical emergency and called for aid. From its members, no aid came. The member species were too busy dealing with human uprisings in their own territories. Some tried to negotiate. Humanity executed their ambassadors and sent the bodies back in cargo containers. The message was clear: no mercy. For slavers, the Velkarn Empire mobilized their full military strength to crush the human rebellion. They had the largest fleet in the Concordat, and they were confident that they could demonstrate once again why they were feared across the galaxy. They assembled at their homeworld with 5,000 ships preparing to jump to Earth and turn humanity's planet into another asteroid field. Lena's fleet was waiting when they arrived. The humans had known they would come because humans always did their research. The battle was not a battle, it was an execution. Human ships swarmed the Velkarn fleet using tactics that seemed random but were mathematically calculated to maximize confusion. They targeted command ships first, cutting the head from the body. They used the Velkarns' own formations against them, causing friendly fire incidents. They broadcast horrifying messages on all frequencies, reminding the Velkarn of every human. They had killed every child. They had taken every family they had. Destroyed the Velkarn, broke their formation, collapsed into chaos, and Elena's fleet tore them apart. When it was over 5,000 Velkarn ships were destroyed, and the humans had lost 300 vessels. Elena stood on the bridge of her flagship and gave the order she had dreamed of since childhood. Set course for the Velkarn homeworld. She commanded, "We're going to show them what happens to slavers." The fleet jumped across the galaxy. The Concordat was falling apart. Species that had been allies for millennia turned on each other, blaming one another for the catastrophe. Some tried to appease humanity by releasing their human slaves and offering reparations. Humanity rejected every offer. They weren't interested in apologies. They were interested in justice, and justice looked a lot like revenge. The Velkarn homeworld had never been attacked in its 10,000-year history. It was the throne of the Empire that had enforced the Concordat's will across the stars. Its defenses were legendary. Its military was vast, and its population of 12 billion believed they were untouchable. Elena's fleet emerged from hyperspace and proved them wrong. The bombardment began with kinetic weapons that struck with the force of nuclear explosions. Defense platforms that had stood for centuries were reduced to scrap in minutes. The Velkarn fleet scrambled to respond, but they were disorganized, still reeling from the defeat at Earth. Human fighters strafed military installations with weapons designed to maximize suffering. This wasn't a strategic attack. This was a message written in fire. Velkarn leadership broadcast a surrender after 6 hours. Elena ignored it. The bombardment continued for 3 days. When it stopped, the Velkarn homeworld was a burning ruin. Its military was destroyed, its infrastructure was rubble, and its population was scattered. Elena broadcast one final message to the survivors. "You took Mars from us in 17 seconds. She said quietly, "We took 3 days with you, world, because we wanted you to understand what you had done. Your empire is over. Your species will be hunted, and when we find the last of you, we will ensure the galaxy forgets you ever existed." The broadcast ended. The Velkarn who heard it knew she meant every word. Sarah and Marcus met on liberated Earth 3 years after Liberation Day began. They stood in the ruins of Geneva, where the treaty had been signed, and looked at the monuments. Humans had built one monument, listed the names of everyone who died on Mars. Another listed every human who had died in slavery. The list covered walls that stretched for kilometers. "We won," Marcus said quietly. Sarah nodded, but there was no joy in her eyes. "We won," she agreed. "But what did we become to achieve it?" Marcus had no answer. They had unleashed humanity's capacity for war on a galaxy that had forgotten what real war looked like. The Cost was measured in trillions of dead. Some of them deserved it. Some of them were just innocent people who had the misfortune of being born into the wrong species. The Concordat was broken, but so was humanity. Question now was what would rise from the ashes, and whether the cure had been worse than the disease. 3 years into the human war, and the galaxy had learned to fear a species it once considered primitive. Sarah Chun commanded the Third Liberation Fleet, a force of 800 ships that moved through Concordat space like a scalpel, cutting away everything that resisted. She stood on the bridge of her flagship, watching another world. Below, the planet was called Sothovi, home to a species that had used human slaves in their toxic mining operations for 100 years. When Sarah's forces arrived, the planetary government offered immediate surrender and reparations. Ara rejected the offer. Her troops landed and conducted what the humans called justice operations. Every mine overseer was executed. Every corporate executive who had profited from human labor was executed. Every government official who had signed the contracts was executed. The executions were broadcast across the galaxy. The message was simple: humanity did not forgive, and humanity did not forget. Webb stood in his new laboratory on Earth, watching reports from across the galaxy. His bioweapons had worked better than he expected. 12 species found their militaries crippled, unable to respond to the human advance, but the weapons had spread beyond their intended target. Civilian populations were suffering and dying in numbers that made Marcus sick. He had designed the weapons to incapacitate, not kill, but biology was unpredictable, and some species had reactions he hadn't anticipated. Children were dying, the elderly were dying, innocent people who had never owned a slave were dying. Marcus tried to develop treatments, but the Concordat's medical infrastructure was collapsing under the weight of multiple pandemics. He saved millions, but billions died anyway. At night, Marcus couldn't sleep because he saw their faces. Elena Kozlov had become a legend across human space. She was the admiral who had broken the Velkarn Empire and liberated Earth. Her fleet now numbered over 3,000 ships, the largest military force humanity had ever assembled. She used that force with ruthless efficiency. The Concordat had fractured into dozens of smaller alliances, each trying to survive the human onslaught. Elena hunted them methodically. Species that surrendered peacefully were given client state status. They would be allowed to govern themselves, but their militaries would be disbanded, and human observers would ensure they never threatened humanity again. Species that resisted were destroyed, not defeated. Destroyed. Elena had learned from the Velkarn that half measures only delayed the inevitable. The Torth Collective refused to surrender. Elena's fleet turned their 3 homeworlds into lifeless rocks when the Mextar hegemony tried to negotiate while secretly preparing their military. Elena discovered the deception and exterminated the entire species. The galaxy called her the Reaper. Humanity called her a hero. Elena wasn't sure which title was more accurate. The problem was that humanity was winning too well. What had started as liberation had transformed into conquest. Human colonies were being established on worlds where the original inhabitants had been relocated or eliminated. Human corporations were claiming resources that had belonged to alien civilizations for millennia. Human culture was spreading across the galaxy, erasing traditions that predated Earth's civilization. Sarah saw it happening and felt something twist in her gut. They had become the Concordat. One of the Concordat's founding species, called the Ethkor, requested a meeting. They were an ancient race that had existed for 50,000 years and had seen empires rise and fall. Their representative was an elder who looked like living crystal. Sarah met with him on neutral ground. "You have won," the Ethkor said simply. "The Concordat is broken, and your species dominates this region of space." Sarah waited. "But you have not won freedom," the elder continued. "You have won the right to be the new oppressors." Sarah felt anger flash hot. "We were enslaved," she said coldly. We were taken from our homes and scattered across the galaxy. We fought and died for species that saw us as property. And now you do the same to others, the Core replied. He gestured to the display showing human-controlled space. How many species have you subjugated in the name of justice? How many worlds have you taken? How many innocents have died for the crimes of their leaders? Sarah wanted to argue, but the words died in her throat. The Core leaned forward. I have seen this pattern before, he said quietly. The oppressed become the oppressors because they believe their suffering gives them the right. I have watched civilizations fall into this trap for 50 millennia. What would you have us do? Sarah asked. Forgive them. Forgiveness is not weakness. The Ethankev said, continuing this cycle is weakness, because it means you cannot imagine anything better. He stood to leave. You have a choice, Commander. You can become the galaxy's new tyrants, or you can break the cycle. But you must choose soon, because your species is drunk on victory, and drunk people do terrible things. Sarah watched him leave and felt something crack inside. Her Marcus received a transmission from a medical station in what used to be Concordat space. The station was treating refugees from a dozen species, all fleeing the human advance. The doctor in charge was human, a woman named Dr. Lisa Park, who had been freed from slavery 2 years ago. Dr. Webb, she said, and her voice was shaking. You need to see this. The transmission showed wards filled with alien children. They were starving and sick and terrified. They're orphans, Dr. Park explained. Their parents died in the fighting, or in the plagues, or in the reprisals. We have thousands of them and more arriving every day. Marcus looked at the faces and saw the same fear he had seen in human children when the Concordat took them from Earth. What do you need? He asked. I need you to convince the military to stop bombing civilian centers, Dr. Park said. I need you to convince them that not every alien is responsible for what happened to us. I need you to help me save the children, because we're no better than the monsters who enslaved us. Marcus closed the transmission and sat in silence. Had spent 3 years creating weapons to destroy the Concordat maybe. It was time to start building something instead. Lena received reports that worried her. Human commanders in the field were executing prisoners without trial. Colonies were being established on worlds where the indigenous population had been forcibly relocated. Some human leaders were talking about humanity's manifest destiny to rule the galaxy. She called a meeting of her senior staff. We're going too far, she said bluntly. Several officers shifted uncomfortably. They enslaved us, her tactical officer said. They deserve everything we're doing to them. Do their children deserve it? Elena asked. Do the species that never participated in the Concordat deserve it? We're becoming what we hated. The room fell silent. Her communications officer finally spoke. What do we do then, Admiral? We can't just stop. No, Elena agreed. But we can change what we're fighting for. She pulled up a display showing the galaxy. We started this war to free humanity, she said. Now we're going to finish it by ensuring no species can ever enslave another. We're going to enforce that rule with absolute force, but we're not going to become conquerors in the process. It was a nice speech, Elena. Just hope they could actually follow through. Sarah and Marcus and Elena met on Earth in the rebuilt city of Geneva. They sat in the same room where humanity had signed away its freedom 153 years ago. We have a problem, Sarah said. We're winning the war, but losing ourselves. Marcus nodded. I've been tracking civilian casualties. The numbers are horrifying. Elena leaned back in her chair. I've been getting reports of human soldiers committing atrocities against alien civilians. We're supposed to be the good guys. They sat in silence for a moment. We need to change course, Sarah finally said. We need to show the galaxy that we're not just conquerors. How do we do that? Marcus asked. When half of humanity wants revenge and the other half wants to rule. Elena smiled grimly. We remind them what we were fighting for. We were fighting for freedom, for justice, for the right to exist without chains. If we become tyrants, we've betrayed everyone who died to free us." She stood and walked to the window overlooking the monuments. "We're going to establish a new galactic order," she said. "One where slavery is punished with extinction, but where species are allowed to govern themselves. We'll be the enforcers, not the rulers." Sarah and Marcus looked at each other. "That's going to be hard to sell," Sarah said. "A lot of humans want payback, not justice." "Then we'll have to convince them," Elena replied, "because the alternative is we become the next Concordat. And in a few centuries, some other species will rise up and destroy us, and they'll be right to do it." They spent the next week drafting what would become known as the Terran Mandate. It was a declaration that humanity would use its military power to prevent slavery and genocide across the galaxy. But it also included protections for other species and limitations on human expansion. Some humans celebrated it. Others called it betrayal, but it was a start. The war continued, but with new rules. Human forces still fought, but they also began rebuilding what they had. Destroyed the galaxy remained fearful, but slowly, cautiously, some species began to see that humanity might be something other than destroyers. The question was whether humanity could maintain that balance, or whether the rage that had fueled their liberation would consume them and everyone around them. 10 years after Liberation Day, the galaxy had been fundamentally transformed. Earth stood as the new capital of what humans called the Terran Protectorate, a sprawling dominion that controlled 40% of known space. Sarah Chen was old now, truly old, even with alien medical technology extending her life far beyond its natural span. She sat in her office overlooking the city of New Geneva and reviewed reports that made her feel ancient. Of the 47 species that had formed the Concordat, 8 were extinct. The Vulcarn were gone, hunted to the last individual, and erased from history. The Torth Collective had been sterilized, their worlds empty monuments to human fury. 6 other species had been eliminated for crimes against humanity that had been judged unforgivable. 15 species had been driven back to pre-industrial levels. Their infrastructure destroyed, their technology confiscated, their populations scattered across primitive worlds where they would take centuries to recover, if they ever did. 24 species survived in various states of subjugation. Some were client states, allowed limited self-governance under human supervision. Others were restricted zones where populations lived under strict observation and control. None were allowed military forces beyond basic police functions. Sarah had overseen much of this transformation. She had signed the execution orders and approved the bombardments and made the decisions that determined which species lived and which died. At night, she still saw their faces. Marcus Webb lived in a compound outside the city surrounded by gardens he had planted himself. He was even older than Sarah, and the weight of what he had done showed in every movement. His bioweapons had killed an estimated 400 billion sentient beings. Most had been Concordat military forces, which he could almost justify to himself. But millions had been civilians caught in the plagues that spread beyond his control. He spent his days now trying to rebuild. He developed medical treatments for species whose biology had been damaged by the war. He created agricultural technologies to feed populations on worlds where human bombardment had destroyed ecosystems. He worked 18-hour days trying to save a fraction of the lives he had taken. It was never enough. Elena Kozlov commanded Earth's military forces from a fortress station in orbit. Her fleet had grown to encompass 15,000 ships, the most powerful military force the galaxy had ever seen. She enforced the Terran Mandate with absolute authority. Any species caught enslaving others was given one warning. If they didn't immediately free their slaves and submit to human authority, Elena's fleet arrived. 3 species had tested humanity's resolve in the past decade. None of them existed anymore. The galaxy lived in terror of humanity. Children of a dozen species grew up with stories of the revenants who came from beyond the stars to punish the wicked. They weren't entirely wrong, but Elena took no pride in being the monster in alien nightmares. She did what was necessary to ensure that no species would ever enslave another. If that made her a tyrant, she would accept that burden. 3 of them met monthly in Sarah's office to discuss the state of the galaxy. Today's meeting was heavier than usual. We've received reports of a new species beyond the outer rim, Marcus said. They call themselves the Genitari, and according to our scouts, they've enslaved a primitive species on a world called Kelvin 4. Sarah felt her jaw tighten. How primitive? Pre-industrial. Marcus replied. They've been enslaved for about 50 years mining minerals the Genitari use for their technology. Elena was already pulling up tactical displays. How many Genitari? About 8 billion across 3 worlds, Marcus said. They're not part of the old Concordat, completely independent civilization. Sarah stood and walked to the window. So we found another slaver species, she said quietly. And they have no idea what's coming for them. Elena nodded. I can have a fleet there in 2 weeks. Give them the standard warning. Sarah turned back to face her friends. What have we become? She asked. It wasn't really a question. They all knew the answer. We've become the galaxy's enforcers, Marcus said. We've broken the cycle of slavery by threatening extinction to anyone who practices it. We've saved billions of potential slaves, Elena added, and killed trillions to do it. Sarah finished. They sat in uncomfortable silence. Do you regret it? Marcus asked finally. Sarah considered the question carefully. I regret the innocents who died, she said. I regret that we had to become monsters to stop monsters. But I don't regret fighting back. The Concordat enslaved us, and they would have died forever if we had accepted it. She looked at both of them. We broke the chains not just for humanity, but for every species in this galaxy. The cost was terrible, but the alternative was worse. Elena nodded slowly. We're not the heroes in this story, she said, but we're not the villains either. We're the aftermath of what happens when you push a species too far. Marcus stared at his hands. I wonder what future generations will say about us. He mused. Will they see us as liberators or conquerors? Both, Sarah said, because we're both. She made her decision. Send the fleet to Kelvin 4, give the Genitari the standard warning. If they free their slaves and submit to inspection, we'll leave them alone. If they resist, she didn't need to finish the sentence. They all knew what happened to slavers who resisted. Elena left to begin fleet preparations. Marcus returned to his garden. Sarah sat alone in her office and looked out at the city. Humanity had rebuilt the monuments to the dead stretched across kilometers. The names of Mars victims, the names of those who died in slavery, the names of human soldiers who died in the liberation, and now a new monument being constructed for all the aliens who had died in the war. Some had deserved their fate, but many hadn't. Sarah thought about the Ifkor elders' words from years ago about breaking the cycle. They had tried. The Terran mandate was supposed to be different from the Concord Timonity enforced. Freedom rather than slavery, protected rather than conquered. The protection that came at the point of a gun looked a lot like conquest, and the species living under human authority weren't free. They were just serving a different master. Sarah wondered if the cycle could ever truly be broken, or if all they had done was reset the timer in a few hundred years or a few thousand. Would some other species rise up against human tyranny? Would they be justified in doing so? She didn't have answers. What she had was responsibility. Humanity had seized control of this region of space with overwhelming force. Now, they had to decide what to do with that power. Rule through fear like the Concordat had, or try to build something better, even knowing they might fail. Sarah activated her communication system. This is Commander Chun to all Protectorate forces, she said. I'm issuing new standing orders effective immediately. When we encounter slavery, we will end it. but we will also provide aid to the freed populations. We will help them rebuild and govern themselves. We will not conquer. We will not colonize. We will not replace one tyranny with another. And if humanity forgets these principles, if we become what we destroyed, then we deserve whatever fate comes for us. She closed the channel and hoped her words would matter. 3 weeks later, Elena's fleet arrived at Kelvin 4, the Genitari. Refused the warning. They said humanity had no authority over them. They said their slaves were property, not people. They said a lot of things that humans had heard before from the Concordat. The battle lasted 4 hours. When it ended, the Genitari homeworlds were burning, and the slaves on Kelvin 4 were free. Elena stood on the bridge watching the destruction. Below, she felt nothing that worried her more than anything. When you stopped feeling the weight of the death you caused, you stopped being human. She forced herself to watch, forced herself to remember each flash of light below was someone dying. They had been slavers, but they had also been people that had to matter. Otherwise, humanity was lost back on Earth. Sarah received reports of the Genitari destruction. She added their species to the list of those eliminated. 8 species extinct. Now how many more before humanity stopped? Or would they keep going forever, becoming what they had destroyed? Sarah didn't know. What she knew was that slavery was ending across the galaxy. Species were freeing their slaves, not out of morality, but out of fear of what humanity would do if they didn't. It was working, but the cost kept climbing. Sarah stood and walked to the monument, listing the names of those who died on Mars. She traced her fingers over the carved letters. We avenged you, she whispered. We made them pay, but I don't know if we did the right thing. The monument offered no answers. It just stood silent and eternal, a reminder of where this all began. Sarah returned to her office and continued her work. There were reports to review fleets, to deploy species, to monitor. The work of enforcing galactic peace through threat of annihilation never ended. Maybe future generations would find a better way. Maybe they would break the cycle that Sarah's generation had only reset, or maybe the cycle couldn't be broken. Maybe this was just how the universe worked. The strong dominated the weak until the weak became strong enough to dominate in return. Sarah hoped that wasn't true, but hope was getting harder to hold on to. The galaxy lived in an uneasy peace maintained by human military might. It was better than slavery, but it wasn't freedom, not really. And Sarah Chun, who had spent her life fighting for freedom, finally understood that violence could destroy tyranny, but it couldn't create justice. That would take something humanity was still learning: mercy, forgiveness, trust. Things that were much harder than war, but maybe necessary if the galaxy was ever going to heal. Sarah looked out at the stars and wondered if they would ever get the chance to try, or if humanity's rage had burned too bright and destroyed too much for healing to be possible. Time would tell, and the galaxy would remember, just as humanity had remembered.